Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another edition of the Black Response. I'm Rashad Robinson, president of Color of Change. And today we are so incredibly excited to have Senator Kamala Harris from the great state of California join us to break down the response that we are trying to build, the conversations we need to have, the ways in which we need to translate our awareness of what's happened with COVID-19 into the power to actually do something about this. Awareness to action. Welcome, Senator Harris.
It is wonderful to be with you again, Rashad, always. And thank you for your leadership and your voice.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Also, you joined us not that long ago on our podcast, which actually got nominated for a Webby Award, which I'm not sure. I don't know if we're going to win, but we got nominated for a Webby Award. So our first.
Congratulations.
So
that's wonderful to hear.
That's
wonderful.
So first of all, I want to just start off, we are in incredibly challenging times.
Yeah.
You are a person who's used to traveling around the country. You are also just in a state that is dealing with so much right now. I just want to ask, how are you doing? How's your family? How's everything going?
Thank you, Rashad. You know what, everyone, look, we are blessed. I mean, the number of people who are suffering in our country right now, suffering. I mean, 1 in 5 mothers is reporting that their children are hungry, right? What is the most recent number? I think 36 million people just in the last 2 months became unemployed with no plan to be unemployed, with no savings, most of them. I mean, before now, we were talking about how almost half of American families can't afford a $400 unexpected expense. Then all of this happened. The people standing in food lines for hours, all of the babies, all of the children who don't have access to the internet, don't have, even if they have broadband, don't have, a laptop, what we're using right now, and are going to miss so much of their schooling and what that will mean in terms of potential permanent damage. So I say all that to say, in the context of what so many tens of millions of people are experiencing right now, I'm great. I'm fine.
Mm-hmm.
I'm fine.
You just laid out so many different issues, and from kind of hunger and health to access to education, and of course the ways in which the economy fuels and engages all of those things. And I think the importance is that both you and I, in different ways, get to wake up every day and do something about it.
Right.
And so I'd love to really have a conversation about some of the things that you're working on right now to help respond to this moment. You have been both introducing legislation on your own in partnership with folks like Ayanna Pressley, who we've also had on this conversation, and other folks. And so I'd love for you to talk a little bit about some of the priorities that you are moving in the Senate.
So thank you. And with wonderful partners, like you said, Congresswoman Pressley has been extraordinary, Senator Booker, Senator Sanders, I could go through the list, Robin Kelly from Illinois, Representative Kelly. So let's just get in there. The way that I think about this pandemic in terms of how, in particular, it is impacting African Americans but all Americans, but I've really been principally thinking about the impact in 3 ways: the public health impact, the economic impact, and the educational impact, right? So the public health impact. Well, first of all, as it relates to all of these things, what this pandemic, like any crisis, what it does and what it has done is it has shown a microscope on these disparities that have long existed frankly forever, because of systemic and institutional racism, because of the biases that exist, because of all the things that you and I and all of us know have been structural and longstanding and historic in our country. And they've just been highlighted now because of this pandemic. So on the public health piece, well, Black folks are 20% more likely to have asthma, 40% more likely to have high blood pressure. Black women 3 times more likely to have lupus, which is an autoimmune disease, than white women. You look at it in terms of sickle cell anemia. The sickle cell survivors and patients are very vulnerable and susceptible to respiratory viruses, right? Which of course is what COVID is. So you then look at that, and then you look at the fact that all of the data is starting to rack up. I mean, I've been talking about the disparities for quite some time since the pandemic started. As of today, even though we are 13% of the population, Black folks are 13% of the population of the United States, 58% of the deaths from this pandemic.
Yep.
Right? Yep. You can look at it in terms of the economic impact and on and on, but I'll just talk even just about the health impact as a perfect example of the point that we need to be collecting racial data as it relates to all of these things, so that when we start talking about a distribution of resources to deal with testing and treatment and ultimately the vaccine, that the resources go to the communities that need it. So I have authored what we have called the Racial Disparities Act, right? Preventing, right, the racial disparities. And so what it is requiring is that there will be the collection of data based on racial disparities. Then that data needs to be analyzed, and by people who are culturally competent to analyze it, right? People from the community, of the community. And then that it would be on the basis of that analysis that resources would be distributed. So instead of what normally happens around here, I'm in DC right now, instead of what normally happens where there's a rote formula where usually the resources get distributed per capita, right? So what's the population size? That's how we determine need. No, I'm saying that in addition to whatever other factors exist, let us take into account racial disparities. So that's one of the things that I'm working on. When, I look at it in terms of also disparities, Rashad, let's again talk about longstanding issues. You and I have been working for years on environmental justice issues.
Yep.
Right? Okay, 70% of all the people who live in low air quality zones, 70% of them are African American. Of all the people in the United States who live in the worst air quality areas of our country, 70% are African American. Well, what's the significance of that? Well, this is a respiratory illness.
Yeah.
It preys on people who have vulnerabilities. And then in the face of all this, do you know that Donald Trump just weeks ago, yet again, messed with the gas emission standards to make them even lower instead of making them higher? Gas emission standards, why have we fought on that? Because it's about air quality.
And so it's so interesting you say that, right? Because sometimes people want to think about all these disparities that you mentioned as sort of like a car accident, like they sort of just happened, right? Instead of that, they've actually been manufactured by a set of choices, and just what you said around.
But not choices by the people in those communities, by the way.
Not by the people in the community, but by decision makers who, make pollution higher in certain communities, then blame people for having respiratory problems and not being able to have the health standards because their communities have been sort of at the end, the receiving end of so much pain. I'm sorry, keep going. Yeah.
That's right. You can look at what's been happening in the prisons. So over 2 months ago now, I wrote a letter to the director of the Bureau of Prisons, the Federal Bureau of Prisons, outlining 25 issues that I could predict would exist in terms of our incarcerated men and women. And what I wanted in terms of accountability. I serve on the Senate Judiciary Committee, but also in terms of oversight, what I asked, are they doing about things like social distancing for incarcerated men and women? What are they doing about getting those men and women PPEs and testing and all of that? And also requesting and demanding that they engage in early release of the most vulnerable populations, pregnant women, the aged, those who are close to the completion of their sentence and pose no threat to their community. All of these things that we know need to exist because it was so predictable. What has now been proven to have happened 2 months later, which is 3,300 federal inmates and 250 Bureau of Prison staff have tested positive for COVID-19, and 49 of the inmates have died. Right?
Yeah.
And so just today, breaking news with you, Rashad, today.
I love it.
I demanded a Judiciary Committee hearing into this issue and demanded that not only would the director of the Bureau of Prisons appear, but Bill Barr, the Attorney General of the United States, needs to also appear and answer to these questions. Because, I reached out to him weeks and weeks ago. I got a call back from his number two and raised these issues even then, not only about our men and women who are in the federal prisons, but also the men and women who are in these federal detention facilities in terms of undocumented immigrants, right? And so these are some of the issues. We're working on small businesses.
Yeah.
So, these relief packages, I voted against them. The first one, as many Democrats did, until it got better, and it was born out of the crisis of the moment. We voted for it, but these relief packages have been absolutely insufficient to meet the need. And as it turns out, on the issue of small business relief, of all that money that has gone out for small business relief, Rashad, do you know that 90% of minority and women-owned businesses did not get the PPP, which is the Paycheck Protection Program?
Yep.
90%. So I have a bill, and this is what I'm working on with Representative Ayanna Pressley. Our bill is named the SOS Act. It's basically Save Our Street. And Save Our Street means save the business down the street, right? The barbershop, the beauty salon, the flower shop, right? The bodega. So what we are proposing is that, one, there would be a carve out of federal relief money that would be $125 billion that would go to small businesses defined as businesses with employees of 10 or fewer people. And then if they're in minority and underserved communities, 20 or fewer people.
Yep.
And that there would be a carve out that they are the ones who would only be entitled to this money, and they would be entitled to a grant of up to $250,000 each. And it would not be, and specifically it excludes publicly traded companies, hedge funds, things of that nature. But our small businesses, our minority-owned businesses, are the lifeblood of our communities. Yeah. And they, may never be able to reopen. And part of the problem also was that the people who got the money are the ones who are banked, right? Who have a relationship with the big banks versus the community bank, right? And we got a call from a lady who runs a beauty salon in California. And she said, look, they want me to fill out all these forms and talk about my vendors. Well, I just get my stuff at the beauty supply store, right?
Yep.
And that's how she does her business. And so we need to make this system work for real small businesses and do it in a way that they can get through this crisis and land on their feet.
Yeah, what a lot of people don't understand is that, because the money was sent through the Small Business Administrations and the big banks were created as a middleman of this whole system, what ended up happening was that so many of our banks, some of our businesses simply did not have access to get that capital, right. Did not have the, and were also just not priorities for some of these big banks, which during your time as Attorney General, fought during the sort of housing crisis as well. And so what we've seen is these big banks, once again, that were bailed out, now get to turn around and be the deciders of who gets support and have made clear decisions. We've heard from so many of our members about their inability to access these loans. And so one of the questions that I have is, right, the House of Representatives, right, is now debating the CARES 2 Act, or what they're calling the HEROES Act.
Right.
It has, and then, if that piece of legislation is passed, it passed in the House, it goes to the Senate, and then it gets debated, and then there'll be some, hopefully, decision about what the next phase of relief to communities looks like. You talked a little bit about some of the sort of priorities. What are also, beyond the priorities, what are some of the things that we also need to fight against? What are some of the things that we should be concerned about with such a big piece of legislation that won't have public hearings, that won't have debates? Right. One of the things I want to open up for the people who are watching and listening is what we need to do as citizens to both champion the things we want and fight against the things that are going to hurt us.
That's right. That's good, Rashad. So I was a part of a hearing in the Judiciary Committee this week I appeared virtually, but they're basically, the Republicans are trying to push this whole immunity from liability thing for corporations, right? And because of let me break down the issue.
Yeah, break it down. Yeah,
They're suggesting, well, a company, a business shouldn't be sued by somebody because they get COVID-19 because they come back to work. That's essentially what they're saying, that it's too much risk to the business. So there should be some immunity if they open back up, because we need to open back up the economy. They say there shouldn't be these kinds of risks, because then the business will not be able to conduct itself and continue. Well, my point is this: let's talk about risk. You want to talk about risk? Let's talk about risk. So when we're talking about that business, well, yes, there is a certain financial cost to opening back up. There will be, which is that to open back up, they need to conduct a safe workplace, just like they needed to do before the pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
But in light of the pandemic, a safe workplace is probably going to require things like social distancing. Well, if you're talking about an assembly line and requiring people to be at least 6 feet apart instead of 2 feet apart, or 1 foot apart, yeah, that might slow down your production line. That might be a financial risk. It might carve into your profit. But the reality is the workers have a right to be safe in the workplace. Mm-hmm. Because what's their risk? Let's talk about relative risk. The risk for the workers is going back to work might kill them. That they may contract this virus, that they may spread it to their families. So my point is that the workers have a right to expect that when they go to work, they will be provided with everything that makes for a safe workplace. And that includes whatever is required in terms of the standards for social distancing, masks, you name it. The other piece of it in terms of worker safety and public health has to be about saying we got to fight for paid sick leave, which mm-hmm. they have been fighting against. We've been trying to get it in there, and they're fighting against it. In terms of what we need to fight against that they're trying to do, this whole liability issue is one that really everybody should pay attention to, because it sounds reasonable. Yeah. In terms of we want the businesses to be able to open up at some point. But at the same time, let's be clear that should not be at the expense of workers' safety.
Yeah. I mean, we're seeing some businesses lobby to be open for opening up places. We're seeing the catch-22 that workers are in, where they have to choose between their safety and their life, and then their economic health, their family's ability to take care of their family. It's a decision that no one should actually have to make in the richest country in the world. And so, these are all sort of really big choices. As someone who's on the inside, right, and you're talking to a lot of folks who are on the outside, right? And so we're on the outside and we're trying to figure out how to make sense, where we should be pressing, how we should make our voices heard. Talk to us about what are the things that folks like you who are championing for the type of solutions that are going to help us recover in a more equitable way. What should we be pushing on? Where should we be pressing?
Yeah. Okay. So one is the Racial Disparities Task Force. So the act that I was talking about around racial disparities would require the convening of public health, community leaders, government leaders to come together and task themselves with analyzing and finding out where the racial disparities are and addressing them. Another thing is the SOS Act, the Save Our Street, right? Because it's about small minority women-owned businesses, and we've got to bring them relief and look at them as a specific subset of the business community that need help, especially when 90% didn't get it in these last bills. Yeah. Another piece is voting. So I have a bill that we've named the Vote Safe Act, and it would be $5 billion to go to states to put in place 3 things. Vote by mail, because almost half the states do not have vote by mail. Yeah. Early voting by at least 20 days, so people can vote up to 20 days before the election and then, figure it out depending on their lives, what's most convenient for them. and then safe voting if there's not vote by mail or people just insist on going to the polls. And so that would be requiring, for example, states come up with things like curbside voting, right? That they come up with things like putting a standard wait time in place. You know, that big election that happened in Wisconsin a few weeks ago, where they were playing political games and forced an election to happen because they thought they were going to elect all these conservative judges. That backfired on them. But what did happen is folks had to stand in line for 2 and 3 hours to vote. And I think over now 50 something people contracted COVID-19, including poll workers. So wait times. What I'm saying there is that the state should say people should only have to stand in line for X number of minutes, and then set up the polling stations so that people would only stand in line for that many minutes, right?
Yeah.
And then the other piece of the Vote Safe Act is to address longstanding issues around bringing more resources to voters with disabilities and more resources for our Indigenous people. In particular around vote by mail, because so many of our Native Americans live in places where there's no postal address.
Yeah.
And so they get cut out of the whole process of being able to vote by mail. So we need to address that as well.
It's another thing with the census, right? In terms of making sure folks are counted at scale for Native Indigenous communities, for rural communities of all races. You know, when you talk about vote by mail, right, there's aspects to it that are important, right? The state of Georgia just passed vote by mail, but they didn't include prepaid stamps on the envelope, which means that you know you want to have vote by mail so people don't leave their house, but then you make people leave their house to get a stamp, and feels
you shouldn't have to pay to vote.
Yes, exactly. Poll tax, which you know is all the ways in which you know, one of the things that you know has animated this moment around COVID-19 is all the ways in which those who have fought against justice, those who have fought against equity, are using this crisis to undo things that we've won. You know, putting in place poll taxes, breaking promises to workers, undoing pollution standards. All of these things are why when we talk about we have to fight against people, and folks may look at us and say, why they always want us to fight against things? It's if we don't stay vigilant. There are folks every single day who wake up and are focused in getting more for themselves at the expense of everyone else.
Well, and Rashad, to the point, I thought it's such a great question that you presented about what people should fight against that might be happening.
Yes.
Because you're also reminding me of another piece of this. They don't want to fund state and local governments. Mm-hmm. We've been fighting to get that. So who's that? That's teachers. That's you. And here's the thing about history that everybody should remember. Back when the laws were literally laws about discrimination and employment, right? And employing Black folks, employing people of color. Some of the only jobs that were available were public service jobs.
Yeah.
Right? It was working for the city. It was working for the state. It was working for the federal government. One of the things that they're trying to also do is get rid of the U.S. Postal Service and privatize that. Well, I'll remind you that how many Black middle-class families grew into the middle class because somebody worked for the post office.
Yep.
Good jobs. Mm-hmm. Good jobs.
Yep.
And those jobs were available where other jobs were not. And now they're trying to privatize the post office. And you know, again, connect that also with vote by mail.
Yep.
Do we want the private sector to start running our mail and making decisions based on profit, making decisions based on who's going to get what kind of service depending on the wealth of their zip code? Yeah. So pay attention to that too, around the U.S. Postal Service and what they're trying to do to privatize it. And specifically what's happening right now is the fight to give it adequate funding so it doesn't go out of business.
These are so important, right? So for folks who are watching, you can go right to the blackresponse.org, the blackresponse.org. We actually have a petition campaign on standing up and fighting to protect the post office.
Okay.
We have campaigns on small businesses, on so many of these issues, clear ways for folks to take action. If you go under resources on the blackresponse.org, you can find all of the sort of different sort of issue areas that Senator Harris has talked about, and ways for you to take action, ways for you to engage from the outside. Our time is almost up here, and I really appreciate you taking time. I know how busy you are in terms of both representing such a large state in the Senate, but also so much of the work to try to give voice to these issues. And I think for a lot of people who are at home, we're also trying in the midst of a new way of being. If we're lucky enough and privileged enough to be able to work from home and digitally, we're trying to make sense of that. If we are an essential worker, we're trying to figure out how to remain safe and keep our family safe while we leave our house. If we've been one of the millions of people who have lost our jobs in this moment, we are trying to figure out how to recover when recovery looks so bleak. But one of the things we try to do in all of our work at Color of Change is, while we are fighting against so much, is also center Black joy. And Black joy for us is not the absence of pain, but the presence of aspiration, the presence of fighting for something as much as we are fighting against it. And I'd love for you to share a little bit about what is giving you joy in this moment. What are you watching or listening to or thinking about that's helping you connect your spirit to the fight ahead and to the journey ahead?
Well, I'll tell you one of the things, and I've said this before, but I find that I'm making more phone calls and less texting with friends, because in moments like this, when people are at least physically isolated, hopefully not emotionally isolated, hearing someone's laugh is the most incredible thing, and reading LOL cannot compare.
Yes.
Right? I love to cook, so I've been cooking up a storm, and that gives me joy. It always does. But I
like to cook. I love to cook too. That's one of my.
We have to exchange the recipes, Rashad.
Yes, we should definitely do. We'll do that. Yes, I would appreciate it. Yeah.
And listening to music, just dancing in my living room. So those are some of the things. I think it is important to find joy as best as we can in the midst of all this suffering, and to also, there is so much that we each have that is our power, and it's just a matter of in dark and difficult moments recognizing that, and reaching out to someone is really an extension of each of our power to really lift somebody else up. And that's important right now. And it is important to not be emotionally isolated. It is normal to feel frustrated, to feel angry, to feel afraid. That is normal. That is healthy feeling in a moment like this. But let's also find joy and time to laugh and time to sing and time to dance.
Thank you for that. We have so much ahead of us, and thank you for laying out, whether it's the work to fight for small businesses, Save Our Streets, SOS, with Representative Presley, the work of data and really being able to understand this crisis, and as a result, be able to fight for the sort of resources to the communities that most need it. All of the work that's going to be necessary to ensure that our prisons and jails, where social distancing is literally impossible, become decarcerated. And then so much of the other work to ensure that Main Street and everyday people in our communities get a recovery, and not just big corporations, that we have the ability to ensure that this country, which we have given so much to, ensures that we have what we need through this crisis. And so thank you for sharing with us. Thank you for joining with us. Stay healthy, stay in the fight. And we are going to keep raising our voices in this moment, keep pushing in this moment to ensure that there is a response that ensures that justice and freedom can be possible.
That's right. Thank you, Rashad. You take care of you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Bye-bye.